So nice to be able to welcome back to the program Dr. Avi Loeb. He is the chair of Harvard's astronomy department. He's an astrophysicist, and today is the drop date. I'm holding it in my hands of his brand new book, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed, Extraterrestrial, the first sign of intelligent life beyond Earth. Dr. Loeb, thanks so much for coming back. I hope that you will humor the POTUS audience by giving us one of the thought experiments that you offer to your students at Harvard.
Well, thanks for having me. I should just start by saying that I search for intelligence in the sky because I often don't find it here on Earth. You know, that's one reason. But regarding my students, I asked them in one of the classes, suppose a spaceship would land and ask you to get in for a trip. Would you do it? And they told me they would do it under one condition, that they can share their experience over social media. Now, to me, maybe it's a generation difference, but to me, that is completely irrelevant. I mean, enjoying the experience of being out there by itself is a thrill. Why do you need to share it with anyone?
And when you ask a follow-up where you say no social media and we'll be passing by a black hole, all of a sudden the willingness dissipates.
Right. And they are worried that by getting into this ultimate prison, they will never be able to come back. And so that's an important consideration. I also recommended a trip to the nearest black hole to my colleagues that work on string theory, because that's a place where they can test their theory. But they suggested that I have an ulterior motive for sending them into a black hole.
Dr. Loeb, the question that you ask and answer in your book is, in simple terms, are we alone? There's a more complicated way that you actually piece it together, but discuss with my audience, what is it you were seeking to address in writing this book?
Right. So actually, I would think that the answer to the question, are we alone, is probably not, because by now we know that half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. And so if you arrange for similar circumstances, you should get similar outcomes. We should not be unusual. We should not be special. Humans over history made the assumption that we are special and unique, and they were wrong all along. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, thought that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and then there are spheres around it, and for 1,000 years people believed him. But then Copernicus and Galileo showed him wrong. The Earth moves around the sun. Many people still believe we are special and unique as biological creatures. There is potentially no life like us out there. I actually think it's very likely that we are common. And just like ants on a sidewalk, we are not special in any way. That's why nobody is visiting us. We don't merit any attention. And in fact, I don't think that we're the smartest kid on the block. You know, when my daughters were young, they tended to think they have special qualities. And once they went to the kindergarten, they found other kids and recognized that, you know, they have qualities better than them, and they got a better perspective. And so the way for our civilization to mature is by going to the cosmic street and finding others. And my book talks about one object that happened to be the first object that we noticed in the vicinity of the Earth that came from outside the solar system. And it appeared like nothing we have seen before, not a comet or an asteroid, rocks that we have seen within the solar system before that. It was very peculiar, and I talk about the properties, why I think it may be something else. And it convinced me after a while, after looking into the data about it for half a year, that it may be artificially produced. Sort of like walking on the beach and seeing most of the time naturally produced seashells or rocks, but every now and then you stumble across a plastic bottle. And Oumuamua, this object, may be the first plastic bottle that indicates an alien civilization for us.
I'm holding in my hand, and I'll show to a Zoom audience that our Sirius XM listeners will be able to then watch. But it's a printout of the New York Times of October 19, 2017, because I wanted to just put myself back in the moment. There's no reference here to that which you're about to describe, but this was a day when President Trump was arguing about health care, where there was a story about ISIS, where there was a controversy over what President Trump had said to the widow of a slain soldier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you maintain that on October 19, 2017, we were at the beginning of a critical 11-day sequence during which time you think we were visited. Please explain.
Right. So this object, which was the first that we noticed from outside the solar system, passed near us and actually was on its way out when we noticed it. And at first, the peculiar fact about it is that its brightness varied by a factor of 10 as it was tumbling. And its brightness was simply reflected sunlight. And it means that the area projected on the sky of this object was changing by a factor of 10. If you imagine a piece of paper that is razor thin, tumbling in the wind, a change in the area that you see by a factor of 10 is huge. It means that the object is 10 times longer than it is wide when projected on the sky. And moreover, the object exhibited an extra push away from the sun without any cometary tail. Usually, when gases evaporate from a comet, they provided a push through the rocket effect. But there was no cometary tail. And in fact, the Spitzer Space Telescope looked very deeply behind it and couldn't trace any carbon-based molecules, nothing. And the question was, what gives it this extra push? And I suggested that it's just reflected sunlight, the way that a wind reflects off a sail that pushes a boat can also be the way that light reflects off a sail, which we call a light sail, and pushes it. And we are currently developing this technology for space exploration. And so it's possible that another civilization mastered this technology by now. And we see just a space debris or some equipment, maybe defunct, that was sent out. You know, we sent out Voyager 1, Voyager 2, and New Horizons. There could be a lot of space junk out there.
The observations that you're relating were captured in Hawaii. What installation exists? Why Hawaii? What's the level of sophistication?
Right. So Congress tasked NASA to find 90% of all the objects that get close to Earth, bigger than 140 meters, about a few hundred feet, the size of a football field, which happens to be roughly the size of Oumuamua, this object. And Pan-STARRS is a telescope that was constructed on Mount Haleakala in Hawaii, Maui, to start this process of tracing all the objects that may come close to Earth, because we know that the dinosaurs were killed by a giant rock. You know, it must have been a beautiful sight, roughly the length of Manhattan, approaching Earth, and it should have been beautiful to watch it getting bigger and bigger, but the fun stopped when it hit the ground. And
Right.
The dinosaurs did not have science or astronomy to allow them to forecast this event. And we are smarter, even though our brain is so much smaller than the body of a dinosaur, it's much more valuable for survival. And we can use our brain to forecast which objects are coming close and perhaps deflect them. So that was the task that the Congress gave NASA. And Pan-STARRS, this telescope in Hawaii, was surveying the sky to look for such objects and found by chance this very first object that came from outside the solar system, roughly the size of 100 meters, by the sunlight reflected off it. And because it was discovered in Hawaii, the name for this object was chosen to be Oumuamua, which means a scout or a messenger from far away in the Hawaiian language.
Was it necessarily manned, and man is probably a bad word choice, but is it possible that it was some type of an alien craft that had no life within it?
Yeah, I mean, everything is possible. We just don't have enough data or evidence. And, science is based on two things. One is evidence. You have to get data. So I would never argue that, we have evidence unless there were all these anomalies that appeared. And then the second ingredient of science is reproducibility. And, since we looked at the sky with pan-stars over a few years and found this object, we shouldn't find more of the same if you continue to look for a few years. And in fact, there would be a new observatory called the Vera Rubin Observatory that is currently constructed in Chile that would be much more sensitive than pan-stars and could discover an Oumuamua-like object once per month. So the idea would be that instead of having this guest for dinner and noticing that it's weird when it exits the front door into the dark street, we should examine the guest when it approaches us. In fact, if the Vera Rubin Observatory will find one of these strange objects on its path towards us, we don't need a rocket that moves too fast. We can just send a camera that will take a close-up photo. And, a photo is worth 1,000 words.
Right. Speaking of photos, there's a rendering. This is not a photograph, but there's a rendering on page 31 of your book as to what you think it looked like. 100 yards long and about 10 yards across, a cigar, more or less. True?
No, this is the artist's illustration that was advertised very broadly. But in fact, an analysis of the reflected light from this object as it was tumbling implies that at the 91% confidence level, and this is a paper published at the end of 2019, at the 90% confidence level, it was disc-shaped, flat, pancake-like, not cigar-like. And that is even more consistent with the kind of idea that it may have been a sail pushed by light.
Your colleagues, your brethren, they disagree. They
Right.
think it was what?
Well, they say business as usual, and they argue, it's probably an unusual rock. And to me, that reminds an analogy with a caveman that is used to playing with rocks all of his life. And if you were to present a cell phone to a caveman, he would think that it's a shiny rock. So obviously people want to believe that the future is similar to the past. That's their comfort zone. They want to stay there. I can mention an anecdote. There was a seminar at Harvard about Oumuamua. And at the end of the seminar, I left the room together with one of my conservative colleagues that worked on rocks in the solar system for decades. And he said to me, "This object is so weird, I wish it never existed." And that's appalling for a scientist to say, because you're supposed to learn from what nature gives you. You're supposed to be grateful for whatever evidence you find, and especially if it's intriguing, if it's anomalous, because nature is trying to tell you something new. And science is a learning experience. We should not assume that the future is the same as the past. If we are not open to discover new things, we will never discover them.
In the book, page 61, you say, "Let us pause here briefly to recap the evidence that emerged about Oumuamua in the weeks immediately following its discovery. It was a small, oddly shaped, shiny object that deviated from an orbit shaped by the sun's gravity without showing any discernible cometary tail caused by the outgassing of a comet's ice turning to steam by friction and the warmth of the sun, despite a deep search for it with the Spitzer Space Telescope and other detectors." An important part of your observation here was that the trajectory had deviated from that which you would expect to see. Am I saying that accurately?
Yes, and in fact, in order to explain the push that the object exhibited, if it were a comet, it would have had to lose about 1/10 of its mass, 10%, which we cannot miss. That's a lot of mass coming out of an object. And we see it in the context of ordinary comets. And in fact, there was a second object that was discovered later on called Borisov, and that looked just like a comet. And so people came to me and said, well, doesn't that convince you that Oumuamua was also natural? Because Borisov looked like a naturally produced comet. And I said, you know, when I dated my wife for the first time, I thought she's special. And since then, I met a lot of women. That didn't change my opinion about my wife.
You conclude another thought experiment toward the end of the book. Don't worry, I'm not giving it all away for free. By the way, it's Avi Loeb's new book, and it's called Extraterrestrial. But there's another thought experiment toward the end of the book where you ask, what if previously we had evidence of extraterrestrial life? Then by the time that we get to the 11 days in 2017, we would have been much more willing to be accepting. And Dr. Loeb, you go on to explain, well, in the mid-70s, we actually did have such evidence by virtue of a mission to Mars. Will you explain?
Right. There was some experiment that was done on Mars and indicated quite likely that there are signs of life there. And I should say that within a month, there will be the Perseverance mission landing on Mars and exploring the surface of Mars. And potentially there will be news from that mission that indicate that life may have existed. Mars had similar conditions to Earth early on, and then it lost its atmosphere because it's 10 times less massive than the Earth, and its surface gravity was not strong enough to hold the atmosphere. And then without an atmosphere, liquid water cannot exist. And so all the oceans or ponds that were on the surface of Mars evaporated, and it lost its capacity to host life. But we can go there and check whether there was life early on. And that would be a change in our view about life in the cosmos, because we will find another place near us where life started. Of course, it's still within the solar system. And I'm most curious about life around other stars, because, as I said, I don't think that we are the smartest kid on the block, and or if you want, not the sharpest cookie in the jar.
Dr. Loeb, I don't want to give it all away for free, but there's an important subject that I know people will want to know. Does the government have any information on this subject, the subject of whether there really is extraterrestrial life, that has not been shared with us? And if that is the case, when might we see such information?
I don't think the government has that information. There are reports on unidentified flying objects that were documented by pilots and the Navy people and so forth. Now, this is a subject of national security because you want to know whether other nations use instruments that or technologies that we are not aware of. But I have a hard time believing that these phenomena that were reported are related to aliens, because frankly, we don't merit a visit. You know, there is nothing really special about us. We are not particularly intelligent. If you check the news, we do a lot of stupid things most of the time. Moreover, there are so many planets in the galaxy that have probably conditions similar to ours that it's unlikely that someone has a purpose of coming and spying on us. However, I should say, instead of focusing on these old reports based on old technologies, on eyewitnesses that saw something unusual, I think we can check whether these reports make any sense by deploying scientific instruments in the same sites from where the reports came. And you know, if we use state-of-the-art cameras and sound sensors, everything we have at our disposal now is so much more powerful than the instruments they used to detect unusual phenomena a decade or two ago. And so I think at a relatively low cost, we can do the experiment by deploying instruments in various places and just monitoring the environment for a long enough time. And so I am very much in favor of applying the scientific methodology, you know, where you have a controlled experiment where you check what's going on. And science is
Understood.
about reproducibility. If there is no...
Yeah. I need to get in a quick final question because I have a time constraint and we're not giving it all away. For those 11 days in 2017, how close did whatever Oumuamua really was get to us on Earth?
Oh, it was roughly 1/10 of the distance between the Earth and the Sun. It was not very close. There is no doubt in my mind that it was not intended to spy on us, because it took it more than 10,000 years to cross the entire solar system all the way to the Oort cloud. And 10,000 years ago, we were not that interesting.
The book is terrific and it's approachable. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for your willingness to come here to SiriusXM's POTUS channel to discuss it. I look forward to seeing you again, Dr. Loeb.
My pleasure.